Hello and welcome to WOBI. It's great to have you with us. Hello and welcome to On the Record. My name's Chris Stanley. I'm here at the Radio City Music Hall in New York, where the World Business Forum is currently taking place. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Ian Bremmer. Ian is a political scientist and a specialist in global political risk. He is the founder of the Eurasia Group, a company that is specialized in offering expertise on the risks and opportunities presented by today's global political developments. And he's also the author of the best-selling book, Every Nation for Itself, Winners and Losers in a G0 World. Ian, good to have you with us.
Sure, good.
Let's go on to the principal topic of your latest book, which basically states that we're experiencing a lack of leadership, global leadership in the world today, which, faced with other sort of changes in the sort of geopolitical context, are resulting in more volatility, more competition, more uncertainty. Tell us about some of these changes which are resulting in these conditions of volatility which we're seeing today.
Well, I mean, there are really three that are most important. The first is that the United States has, for a multitude of factors, wants to play much less of a role internationally. We don't want to be the world's policeman. We don't want to lead globalization in every corner. We don't want to spend as much money on it. Certainly don't want our troops everywhere. And some of that is the president, but a lot of it is the fact that Americans just don't feel they benefit from it. The world's harder to navigate. We had very challenging wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Americans didn't feel like they benefited, a lot of them, from US-led globalization. They want to focus more at home. So it's really unpopular to take that kind of a role. The second reason is that American allies are much harder to corral. The fact is that Europe is really distracted coming off the Eurozone crisis, the Brits coming off the Scotland referendum and whether they'll be in the EU at all, the French with the least popular government they've had since World War II, the Germans much less aligned with the US generally because, I mean, this is not a militarist government. They focus much more on economic relations with countries like China than they do on geopolitical challenges, and they've been on the wrong end of the US NSA scandal and Mr. Snowden. So it's harder to get the allies together. And the other countries in the world that aren't allies of the US, who you wouldn't expect to play a big role, they are becoming more important, right? China's now the second largest economy. It will become the largest. The BRICS are generally expanding quite a bit. Their footprint matters more. But their values and priorities and certainly their political and economic systems are very different than those of the advanced industrial democracies. So, I mean, if you put all three of those factors together, none of which are going to change anytime soon, in fact, in many ways they'll intensify, it means that you don't see global leadership. You do see leadership, but it's much more localized. It's much more within the country, it's your direct neighborhood, and so any challenges that require broader-based international coalitions or one big COP, you're just not going to have the kind of results and response that you might have hoped for.
So if we're not seeing global leadership, and you think that these forces are intensifying, what's going to be the result? We're going to see more sort of localized spheres of influence emerging?
Yes, you will. And what's interesting is that what drives leadership in different parts of the world is very different from one another. So in Europe, leadership is being provided by the Germans. It's focused very much on economic and political harmonization. It's reasonably transparent. It's reasonably voluntary. A lot of it is fiscal austerity, right? And getting things right, rule of law. But if you go to Eurasia, which isn't far away, it's actually not voluntary. It's driven by Russia. It's mostly coercive. It's not very transparent. And it's driven by energy relations and security relations. And if you get that wrong, as Ukraine has to their chagrin, things can go very badly for you. You go to the Middle East, well, who's driving leadership in the Middle East? There are a lot of countries that want to. I mean, the Iranians want to, the Saudis want to, the Turks want to, the Israelis to a degree have their own view, right? But none of those views are in any way complementary. In fact, they're directly in opposition with each other. And what that means is that the Middle East in this environment is most likely to continue to deteriorate into far greater structural conflict. And then perhaps the most important region of the world economically is Asia. And what drives leadership in Asia is very different. The Chinese are clearly driving economic leadership with the largest trade relations with most of the key countries in bilaterally in that region. And yet the United States still has by far the most important security relationship with most countries. And those influences are shifting pretty quickly. And so if you're a country in Asia, you really want to be able to balance and hedge and do both. But that's increasingly going to be hard to do. So, I mean, you asked me a fairly simple question. I've just given you a fairly complicated answer. And if you're a business person trying to actually navigate, you want one world that you can invest in, one set of customers, and it's clear, one model, right? You want to be a big global multinational. And everything that responds to what I'm saying is that you actually need very different models to invest or not invest in these increasingly very disparate parts of the world.
I mean, how's that going to impact stability? I mean, it sounds very unstable, what you're describing. It's shifting, it's a lot of movement, there's no one policeman there anymore. Are things going to become even more unstable?
Well, they are good. Of course they'll become more unstable. We're not heading towards World War.
Okay.
So, but you are, I mean, anyone that's watched the news in the past year understands that we have seen a proliferation of small conflicts all over the world, getting larger and popping up everywhere. And that can be whether you're talking about the impact of climate change, or you're talking about Ebola and infectious disease, or whether you talk about traditional geopolitical conflicts in Gaza or Libya or Yemen or Afghanistan or Pakistan or northern Nigeria or Mali or Iraq or Syria or China or Hong Kong or the East China Sea. How much I run out of breath before I can actually finish that list. And the point is that these brush fires, when they get bad, the countries that have the most proximate interest will go rush over and they'll try to step on them and they'll try to put them out, and maybe they won't put them out completely, and maybe they'll start smoldering again, but then we'll wait until there's another one, and then that's not a stable environment.
But you think that's just going to be, that's the new norm?
I think it is just starting. I think it's just starting. We're not even close to seeing what that's going to look like yet, because the United States still, for everything that I've said, the US still is providing a fair amount of leadership, and China is still quite small compared to what it will be in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time. And yet they're still very unwilling to play any leadership role at all globally. So we have to go through that transition, I think, before you start to see your way out of this process. What I call a G0, not a G7, not a G20, but the absence of global leadership. I think that process has just started. It was born with the financial crisis. We realized it only in the last year or so, and it's not yet affecting most CEOs in the way they make decisions. Oh, I mean, they want to know about it. They want to learn. But if you ask me, are they really changing their business model? The answer is no. Well, then clearly it can't yet matter that much. And here's the point. If the US markets are still doing very well, and it doesn't really affect CEOs and the decisions they make, then clearly it has to continue to expand, because there's no reason to respond to it. I mean, there's a reason to respond to it if you're Ukrainian. There's a reason to respond to it if you're Liberian or if you're from Mali. But the people that have the power, that are making the decisions, are not from those places.
So what do you think businesses should be doing? You're saying essentially they're potentially making a mistake by not addressing these issues at the moment?
I think in particular, businesses, look, the average CEO tenure in the United States is just over 5 years. Shareholders force them to act with a much more short-term orientation towards the bottom line. And I'm saying that I think this level of volatility requires a reorientation away from short-term growth and towards long-term resilience. And that particularly is true with exposures to emerging markets, most importantly China. So many companies have made huge long-term bets on China, when the reality is that the growth is there, but the uncertainty of that growth is enormous. Chinese with a lot of money don't make the kind of bets long-term on China that Americans do. I mean, if you're Chinese with a lot of money, you want to put it someplace else, actually. Well, given that they know the country better than we do, we should learn from that. And so we need to hedge a lot more. We need to understand just how wide the potential scenarios for development in China are, and what those would mean for Western multinational investors.
So hedging is one thing. What other factors can build in resilience into a company?
There are lots. It depends on what kind of a company you are. I mean, one thing that you can do is you can be a conglomerate. You can be able to make different types of bets by virtue of having different types of business lines, right? You can also be in sectors where you don't have competitors that are significant, even in countries that are unstable or that may have governance that goes against you. Look, the biggest problem that multinational corporations have right now is that they're being forced to make alliances with governments. And companies don't want to do that. Companies want to be like Coca-Cola. Coke's in every country in the world except Cuba and North Korea. A 5-year-old sees a red can, it looks like a Coke to that kid, right? That's what you want to do. But if you're Google and the NSA in the United States is telling you, actually, we need you to behave in a certain way with American national interests in mind, that means that Google in other countries that aren't so friendly to the US is going to be seen as a potential enemy, which is antithetical to what Google wants to accomplish as a model, as a global multinational, as a global corporation. If you are investing in China, right, as an American corporation, investing in Russia as an American corporation, you increasingly are being told that if you don't act Chinese, you don't give us your technology, you don't have a JV with a Chinese company, which will long-term really destabilize your business model, you're going to have a serious problem. Well, companies absolutely don't want to be put in that position. They don't want to talk to political scientists. I mean, if you're a company, you much rather live in a world where you're only talking to economists. You just want to know where the growth is. My entire issue is that a world of geopolitical volatility is one where corporate CEOs actually need to understand which governments they are aligned with and aren't aligned with, and which governments they can safely ignore and for how long, whether that's changing, and how to invest accordingly. And that's not just about hedging. That's about, in some cases, embracing a government. That's about, in some cases, saying, you know what, I can't do that country. I just can't do it. Because it may look good for me for a year, but ultimately my model is antithetical to what's happening in that country. And that's a very difficult decision for companies to make when all they really want to do is talk about opportunities.
What about the unforeseen risks? Nassim Taleb made the term black swan very popular in recent years. What are some of the black swans out there? It's almost a tautology. You can't predict a black swan, but what are some potential black swans that might be?
I've always liked the term gray swans, which Nassim doesn't use. I love Nassim. I think he's fantastic. But I mean, as a political scientist, I think the swans that you think are black, but in reality are gray because you're not focusing on these issues, but other people are. Those are the ones you really need to understand.
For example?
You know, well, I mean, I think lots of the political risks we're talking about are things that companies don't necessarily pay a lot of attention to. So one that would be really interesting right now is cyber from Russia. Everyone talks about cyber attacks from China, but in reality, the Chinese are much more focused on stability and the ability to keep doing business in a global economic environment that is relatively hospitable to them. The Russians use cyber in a much more strategic way to support their government, not to support their companies. The fact that the Russians are now being heavily sanctioned by the US and President Putin views that as a personal threat. Well, we've now seen massive cyber attacks against JP Morgan and other companies, other banks, which are said to be from Russia, directly connected to the Russian government. That is, in my view, a very clear response to the sanctions being placed on the Russians by the US. And you know, the thing that's prevented the Russians from engaging in cyber attacks that really could do calamitous damage to the financial architecture of the US has been fear of retribution and their own restraint. And given where US-Russia relations have gone over the course of the last year, it's hard for me to bet as much on both of those things going forward as I might have. So I think that is a very clear gray swan that when it happens will clearly be seen by most people as being a black swan because it's absolutely not what they're paying attention to.
So you're a little nervous about that situation.
You know, I don't get nervous about things in the sense that I'm an upbeat person who generally just I'm existentially optimistic. We're here, we have incredible opportunities, and why be down? But the reality is that if you look at the risks in the world today, which really could be catastrophic, one that I would be much more seriously worried about would be just how much power has been consolidated in the hands of one person, Mr. Putin, who really feels wronged and aggrieved in a very personal way, in a way that threatens his own long-term survivability by the United States. And actors, when they're put in those sort of positions, are willing to behave in ways that otherwise might not seem as considered or rational by the West. And we have a very hard time putting ourselves in the shoes of people we disagree with. We don't like doing it. We need to do it much more effectively.
What you mentioned that's one of them. Are there any others on a similar level? That's
North Korean implosion is always one in a world where information revolution is much faster, and to maintain a totalitarian regime, you need to maintain control of information. It's hard to imagine that going on for too much longer, and depending on how it implodes when it does, the dangers for South Korea and for companies that have South Korean supply chain, I think, would be significant. So that would be another one. And the most important one, which is related to the hedging strategies I talked about before, is what kind of pushback you see in China from elites that have a lot to lose if Xi Jinping's economic transformation program continues to proceed as is planned.
Let's just talk briefly about US-China relations. We talked around it a little bit, specifically about that. How do you see that developing over the course of the next 5 or 10 years?
I suspect it'll get worse before it gets better. It has the potential to get better. But I mean, the fact is China's getting much larger, and the Chinese government does feel taken advantage of by Western multinationals who do a lot of business in China but take as much profit as they humanly can out of that country and bring them back to the States and to shareholders, which is, of course, their fiduciary responsibility. But if you're the Chinese government, your view is that you need to use your lack of rule of law, your state connections, ability to direct capital to companies and make them more competitive, and the attractiveness of the Chinese market, as well as the cyber capacity that the Chinese government and military has. You need to use those things to level the playing field in your favor. And so we see now all of these cases of antitrust and anti-monopoly that are being brought against Western firms, saying that, oh, your prices are too low, and you're acting in a monopolistic fashion, and we're going to fine you. And by the way, if you go and bring your lawyers in, the fines are going to go higher, right? So those threats that are leading firms like Adobe to just leave and pull all of their R&D and manufacturing out of China, that have led the American Chamber of Commerce to put a report out just a few weeks ago talking about the potential need to bring the Chinese government to the WTO to infringements on anti-monopoly on the basis of the way they're behaving. You talk to CEOs of Western multinationals privately, and they will tell you, a lot of them will tell you, they're very concerned about the investment climate becoming much more challenging because of the government and because of their state-connected competitors in China. And I don't see any leverage the U.S. has in the near term, especially given how distracted we are with other foreign policy priorities we consider more important, with the desire to have the Chinese be on the sidelines and not be an active problem. It's hard to imagine that we'll see a concerted response that will be effective in that environment.
Okay, interesting. Faced with a lack of leadership, do you see non-state actors coming in to fill the vacuum to a certain extent?
Non-state actors are definitely becoming more important. I think the other thing that's becoming more important is sub-state actors. In other words, the U.S. government is not leading very well, and very little legislation is getting passed by Congress, but there's enormous amounts of legislation getting passed that actually does matter at the state level, at the municipal level. You see this happening on energy, on immigration, on trade, on same-sex marriage, on legalization of drugs. I mean, on most any area of policy debate, there is actually a lot of proactive policy getting done. And you look at healthcare, which Obama, after an enormous fight, got done not quite to his satisfaction, but was a big policy. But of course, that happened first at the state level too, under former Governor Mitt Romney. So I mean, the fact is that a lot of these things are happening, and I see that happening in a bunch of European states. Devolution of power, certainly. I mean, post Scotland and Britain, the Scots will end up with more fiscal responsibility, and I think they'll be governed more effectively as a consequence of that. There's certainly more proactive legislation. And along with that, public-private partnerships will play a bigger role in terms of infrastructure development, local governments partnering with major corporations, with foundations. Of course, non-governmental actors are also having a more important role in a destructive way, which we see with the rise of ISIS, the most powerful and well-funded terrorist organization in the history of mankind. And we'll also see that, I am sure, with gangs of cyber criminals and other illicit networks that will take advantage of the fact that much of the world is not effectively governed, and some of it, in increasingly large amounts, are fundamentally stateless.
To close, Ian, I would love to talk to you more, but we've run out of time. So I want you, if you could maybe give us your vision for 2015, what you see. It's a very broad question. The biggest risk and the biggest opportunity facing the world in terms of geopolitical threats, geopolitical opportunities for the world, for business?
Well, I mean, near term, the biggest geopolitical opportunity has to be that all of the major Asian leaders, right now at least, are popular and engaging in economic reform, and they've got some wind in their sails. And we see that in India, we see it in China, and we see it in Japan. We might even start seeing it in Indonesia by the time we get 2015. That's a very big deal, and it's a part of the world which is economically enormously important, and it's growing quite robustly. So, I mean, if they're doing that and they're doing it on their agenda, they're not responding to crisis, that's quite positive. Biggest risks, I mean, right now clearly have to be coming out of the Middle East and Russia, right? And for very different reasons. Again, Russia, because his willingness, Putin's willingness directly as one person to act in a very destructive way internationally because he feels put upon, that's high, and that could have a direct impact on the European economy, could push them back into recession. And that could lead to direct confrontation between the U.S. and Russia in ways we don't want to see on cyber. Middle East is just going to continue to deteriorate. We won't care as much because of the energy revolution. It's going to matter an awful lot to people in the Middle East. So as so often, the risks you talk about depend so much on the basis of who you're looking at. If we were talking about climate change, there's a massive risk if you're living in the Maldives, but in the United States, this doesn't even hit the top 10 right now, and that of course is part of the reason why the G0 is so important in thinking about the world order as it emerges.
Ian, it's been great. Thank you so much for your time today.
Sure.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure to have you with us. Hope you've enjoyed the show, and until the next time, goodbye.